Colonel Marcus Wellington stepped out of the black sedan at the gates of Buckingham Palace, his chest puffed with military pride. The late afternoon London sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as tourists gathered around the iconic, red-uniformed Queen's Guards standing at their posts. Marcus had served 25 years in the U.S. Army, rising through the ranks with determination and an unwavering belief in American military superiority. He was in London for a NATO conference, but today was his free day to explore the city. His wife Sarah had suggested visiting the palace, knowing Marcus's fascination with military traditions. However, what she didn't anticipate was how her husband's competitive nature would manifest when faced with what he perceived as ceremonial soldiers. Marcus wore his dress uniform, despite Sarah's gentle protest that it wasn't necessary for sightseeing. The ribbons and medals adorning his chest told the story of his distinguished career, including 2 tours in Afghanistan and various commendations for leadership. He walked with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command, his eyes scanning the guards with a mixture of curiosity and subtle disdain. "Look at them," Marcus whispered to Sarah as they approached the main gate. "Standing there like statues in those ridiculous hats. I bet they've never seen real combat." His voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who believed his experience made him superior to these parade soldiers. Sarah, a diplomatic corps officer herself, felt a knot forming in her stomach. She knew that look in her husband's eyes, the same expression he wore when he felt the need to prove himself. "Marcus, please," she whispered. "Let's just take some photos and enjoy the tour." But Marcus was already studying the nearest guard, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, standing perfectly still despite the growing crowd of tourists. The guard's rifle was held at the precise angle, his red tunic immaculate, and his expression completely neutral. To Marcus, this represented everything he found frustrating about ceremonial military roles, all show and no substance. The crowd around them grew larger as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Tourists from around the world chatted excitedly in various languages, taking selfies and marveling at the precision of the British Guards. Children pointed in wonder at the tall black bearskin hats, while their parents explained the history and significance of the tradition. Marcus, however, saw an opportunity to demonstrate what he believed was superior American military bearing. He straightened his uniform jacket and approached the guard post with deliberate steps, ignoring Sarah's attempts to hold him back. The afternoon was about to take a turn that would change his perspective forever, though he had no way of knowing it yet. The guard he approached was Lance Corporal James Morrison of the Grenadier Guards, a veteran of 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Iraq. Behind his stoic expression lay years of combat experience, but also the discipline and pride that came with serving in one of Britain's most elite regiments. He had been standing at his post for nearly an hour, aware of every movement in the crowd while maintaining the perfect stillness required of his position. As Marcus drew closer, several tourists began to notice the interaction developing between the American officer and the British Guard. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. The atmosphere grew tense as Marcus positioned himself directly in front of the guard, his chest thrust forward in a display of military posturing that made Sarah's heart race with embarrassment and concern for what was about to unfold. Marcus stood directly in front of Lance Corporal Morrison, close enough that he could see the fine details of the guard's uniform. The red tunic was pristine, every button polished to perfection, and the white belt crossed his chest with mathematical precision. But Marcus wasn't impressed by the presentation. Instead, he saw it as evidence of a military focused on appearance rather than combat effectiveness. "Soldier," Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard and drawing the attention of nearby tourists. "I'm Colonel Wellington, United States Army. 25 years of service, including real combat operations." He paused, expecting some kind of reaction from the motionless guard. When none came, his irritation grew. Lance Corporal Morrison remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, following the strict protocols that governed his duty. He had dealt with challenging tourists before, but something about this American officer's tone suggested this encounter would be different. Still, his training took precedence, and he maintained his position without the slightest movement or acknowledgement. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as other visitors began to gather around. phones and cameras now openly pointed at the developing scene. She could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages, none of which sounded particularly favorable toward her husband's behavior. A British couple nearby shook their heads disapprovingly, while a group of Japanese tourists looked confused by the Americans' aggressive approach. "I said I'm addressing you, soldier," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "In the real military, when a superior officer speaks to you, you respond with proper respect." His own military bearing, which had served him well throughout his career, now seemed misplaced and arrogant in this historic setting. The irony was lost on Marcus that he was demanding acknowledgement from a guard whose very purpose was to remain unmoved by such distractions. Morrison had stood through thunderstorms, heat waves, and countless attempts by tourists to break his concentration. He had maintained his post while processing the grief of losing fellow soldiers in combat, and he had stood guard during state ceremonies where the slightest mistake could have international implications. A police officer stationed nearby began moving closer, recognizing the potential for the situation to escalate. London's Metropolitan Police were well trained in handling incidents involving the Queen's Guard, understanding the delicate balance between tourist engagement and protecting both the guards and the public. The officer's movement caught Sarah's attention, adding to her growing anxiety about her husband's behavior. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus announced, his voice now loud enough that tourists 50 feet away could hear clearly. "You're all ceremony and no substance. I bet you've never faced real danger, never had to make life or death decisions under fire. You just stand there in your costume, playing dress-up soldier for the cameras." The crowd around them had grown substantially, with many tourists clearly uncomfortable with the American officer's aggressive behavior toward the silent British Guard. Some began to walk away, their pleasant sightseeing experience soured by the confrontation, while others remained, seemingly fascinated by the unfolding drama. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Marcus's words had any effect. Behind his motionless exterior, the young lance corporal was remembering the faces of friends who hadn't returned from Afghanistan, the weight of responsibility he had carried during his deployments, and the pride he felt in serving his country both in combat and in this ceremonial role that represented centuries of British military tradition. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd stepped forward slightly, his own military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. His weathered hands gripped a walking stick, and his eyes showed the kind of steel that comes from years of service. He watched Marcus with growing disapproval, his expression suggesting that he was considering intervening in the situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond acceptable tourist behavior. Marcus, oblivious to the changing mood of the crowd and the approaching police officer, prepared to escalate his confrontation even further, completely unaware that he was about to learn a lesson in humility that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The tension in the courtyard was now palpable, as Marcus took another step closer to Morrison, violating the clearly marked boundaries that tourists were expected to respect. His frustration at being ignored had transformed into something more dangerous, wounded pride mixed with an overwhelming need to assert dominance over what he perceived as an inferior. "Soldier, maybe you didn't hear me, because that ridiculous hat is blocking your ears," Marcus said with a cruel laugh, reaching toward Morrison's bearskin cap. The crowd gasped collectively as several people realized what was about to happen. Sarah called out, "Marcus, no!" But her voice was lost in the murmur of shocked tourists. The moment Marcus's hand made contact with the guard's uniform, everything changed. Morrison moved with lightning speed and precision that spoke of extensive combat training. In one fluid motion, he stepped back, brought his rifle to a defensive position, and issued a sharp, commanding shout that echoed across the courtyard. "Stand back. Do not touch the Queen's Guard." The transformation was immediate and stunning. The man who had appeared to be nothing more than a ceremonial statue suddenly became every inch the professional soldier, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life or death situations. The crowd immediately stepped back, recognizing real military presence when they saw it. Marcus stumbled backward, genuinely shocked by the guard's sudden movement and the power in his voice. For the first time since approaching the post, he found himself speechless, staring at a soldier whose demeanor had completely changed while maintaining perfect military discipline. "Sir, you will step back behind the marked line immediately," Morrison continued, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. Any further interference with a Queen's Guard in the performance of his duty is a serious offense under British law. His eyes, which had been focused on the distance moments before, now looked directly at Marcus with an intensity that made the American colonel understand he was facing a true professional. The police officer who had been approaching now quickened his pace, speaking into his radio as he moved through the crowd. Other guards at nearby posts had also shifted their stance, ready to respond if the situation required additional intervention. The entire atmosphere of the courtyard had changed from a pleasant tourist destination to something much more serious. Sarah finally managed to push through the crowd to reach her husband, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him away from the confrontation. "Marcus, please, we need to leave now," she whispered urgently, her diplomatic training telling her that this situation was about to become much worse if her husband didn't immediately back down. But Marcus's military pride was now fully engaged, and being publicly corrected by a soldier he had been dismissing as ceremonial was more than his ego could handle. "You just pointed a weapon at a superior officer," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "That's insubordination in any real military." "Sir," Morrison replied with perfect military bearing, "you are not my superior officer. You are a foreign national who has just committed an assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. I suggest you comply with the police officer who is approaching before this matter becomes more serious." The crowd was now completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond a typical tourist incident. Many of the British visitors seemed proud of their guards' professional handling of the situation, while others appeared embarrassed by Marcus's behavior representing their American allies so poorly. The elderly British gentleman, who had been watching the confrontation, stepped forward, his military bearing now unmistakable. "Colonel," he said to Marcus, his voice carrying decades of command authority, "I suggest you listen to the young man. As a former brigadier in Her Majesty's forces, I can assure you that you are making a serious mistake if you continue this course of action." Marcus turned to face this new voice, seeing in the old man's eyes something that finally began to penetrate his anger, the recognition of a fellow soldier who had earned his respect through genuine service and experience. But his pride was still driving him forward, even as the situation spiraled completely beyond his control. The police officer reached the group just as Marcus was about to respond to the elderly brigadier. "Sir, I need you to step back and provide identification," the officer said to Marcus in the calm but authoritative tone that London police used in tense situations. His hand rested casually near his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. Marcus reluctantly handed over his military identification, his hands shaking slightly as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The crowd continued to watch, in fascination as the drama unfolded, many now recording the incident with their phones. Sarah stood beside her husband, her face pale with embarrassment and worry about the potential consequences of his actions. While the police officer examined Marcus's credentials, the retired brigadier approached Lance Corporal Morrison. "Well handled, son," he said quietly, his voice filled with approval. "Textbook response to an assault on a guard." Morrison nodded respectfully but maintained his professional demeanor, aware that the situation was still developing and required his continued attention. "Perhaps," the brigadier said, turning back to Marcus, "you would benefit from learning something about the young man you just attacked." His voice carried the weight of someone who had commanded troops in real combat and had little patience for ignorance disguised as superiority. The elderly officer gestured toward Morrison, who remained at perfect attention despite the ongoing commotion around his post. "Lance Corporal Morrison here served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards. He was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry during an operation in Helmand Province, where he single-handedly held off a Taliban assault for over an hour while evacuating wounded civilians." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the brigadier continued. "He also served in Iraq, where his unit was responsible for training local forces while under constant threat of insurgent attacks. The ceremonial soldier you just dismissed has seen more real combat than most soldiers experience in an entire career." The crowd murmured with approval and newfound respect for the young guard, while Marcus struggled to process this information. Everything he had assumed about Morrison and the Queen's Guard was being systematically dismantled by someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. The Queen's Guard, the brigadier explained for the benefit of everyone listening, are drawn from active combat regiments. They rotate between ceremonial duties and operational deployments. Every man standing guard at these posts has earned his position through military excellence, not just the ability to stand still in a nice uniform. Sarah touched her husband's arm gently, seeing the shame beginning to replace the anger in his expression. She had tried to warn him, but his pride had prevented him from listening. Now he was learning the hard way that his assumptions about British military traditions were completely wrong. The police officer returned Marcus's identification and spoke quietly with him for several minutes, explaining the seriousness of assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard and the potential legal consequences he was facing. The officer's tone was professional but firm, making it clear that only Morrison's restraint and professionalism had prevented the situation from becoming much worse. The guard showed remarkable discipline, the officer told Marcus. He could have been justified in using much more force to defend himself. Instead, he handled the situation exactly as his training required, with minimum necessary force and maximum professional bearing. Morrison himself remained silent throughout these explanations, his eyes once again focused on the distant point that helped him maintain his ceremonial position. But those who looked closely could see the slight relaxation in his shoulders. That suggested he appreciated having his service and professionalism recognized by both the retired brigadier and the police officer. Marcus looked up at the young soldier he had so badly misjudged, seeing him now not as a ceremonial decoration, but as a fellow warrior who had earned his respect through service and sacrifice. The weight of his mistake was becoming unbearable, and he knew that he needed to find a way to make amends for his inexcusable behavior. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of the tourists looking at the guards with new understanding and respect. The incident had become an impromptu lesson in military history and tradition, showing everyone present that there was much more to these silent sentries than met the eye. The weight of his actions settled on Marcus like a heavy blanket as he stood in the courtyard, surrounded by disappointed faces and the lingering tension of his confrontation. The police officer had finished his preliminary investigation and was preparing to escort Marcus away for formal questioning. But the retired brigadier raised a hand to request a moment. "Officer, if I may," the brigadier said respectfully, "I believe this gentleman might benefit from understanding the full context of what just occurred before any formal proceedings begin." The police officer nodded, recognizing the wisdom in allowing a senior military figure to address the situation from a professional standpoint. Marcus found himself standing face to face with Morrison again, but this time the dynamic was completely different. The young guard maintained his professional bearing, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of understanding rather than anger. Despite being assaulted and publicly disrespected, Morrison showed no signs of personal animosity toward the American colonel. "Lance Corporal Morrison," the brigadier said formally, "would you be willing to share with Colonel Wellington the nature of your service, so that he might better understand the caliber of soldier he encountered today?" Morrison's response was crisp and professional, demonstrating the discipline that had carried him through multiple deployments. "Sir, I enlisted in the Grenadier Guards at age 18, Morrison began, his voice steady and clear. "I completed basic training and advanced infantry courses before my first deployment to Afghanistan in 2019. During my 3 tours, I served as a section leader responsible for training Afghan National Army units while conducting counterinsurgency operations in Helmand and Kandahar provinces." Marcus listened with growing amazement as Morrison continued to detail his service record. The young man spoke without boasting or embellishment, simply stating facts about operations that Marcus recognized as some of the most dangerous and complex military missions of recent years. "My unit was responsible for establishing security in areas where Taliban forces regularly conducted ambush attacks on coalition forces," Morrison explained. "We worked directly with local populations to build trust and gather intelligence while maintaining defensive positions against continuous threats." The retired brigadier nodded approvingly as Morrison described his service, occasionally adding context about the specific challenges faced by British forces in Afghanistan. Marcus began to understand that the young guard possessed exactly the kind of combat experience and leadership skills that he had spent his career developing and respecting in his own soldiers. The incident for which Lance Corporal Morrison received the Military Cross, the Brigadier explained, involved a coordinated Taliban attack on a civilian compound where his unit was conducting a medical aid mission. When the compound came under heavy fire and the evacuation route was cut off, Morrison maintained a defensive position alone for over an hour, while his teammates evacuated wounded civilians and medical personnel. Sarah watched her husband's expression change as he processed this information. The arrogance and dismissive attitude that had characterized his behavior throughout the afternoon was being replaced by something she rarely saw in him: genuine humility and respect for another soldier's accomplishments. During that action, Morrison continued matter-of-factly, "We estimated that hostile forces numbered approximately 40 fighters with heavy weapons support. My position came under direct fire for the entire duration of the engagement, but maintaining that position was essential to protecting the evacuation route." The police officer, who had been listening to the conversation with growing interest, made a note in his report about Morrison's exemplary service record. It was clear that this information would factor into any decisions about how to proceed with the incident involving Marcus's assault on the guard. Marcus realized that he was in the presence of exactly the kind of soldier he had always claimed to admire, someone who had faced genuine danger with courage and professionalism, placing duty and the safety of others above personal safety. The irony that he had attacked and insulted such a person while claiming superior military credentials was almost overwhelming. "Lance Corporal," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sounds of tourists and traffic in the background. "I owe you an apology." It was the first step toward acknowledging the magnitude of his mistake, but Marcus knew that words alone would not be sufficient to address what he had done. Morrison nodded slightly, accepting the apology with the same professional grace he had shown throughout the entire incident. His response demonstrated the kind of military bearing that comes from genuine confidence and experience, rather than the need to prove superiority over others. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over London as Marcus stood before Morrison, struggling to find words adequate to express his regret. The crowd had largely dispersed, leaving only a few curious onlookers and the core group involved in the incident. Sarah remained close to her husband, offering silent support while watching him grapple with the consequences of his actions. "Lance Corporal Morrison," Marcus began again, his voice stronger now but filled with genuine remorse, "I need you to understand that my behavior today was completely inexcusable. I made assumptions based on ignorance and let my pride override my judgment as both an officer and a gentleman." The retired brigadier watched this exchange with approval, recognizing the difficult process of a career military officer, acknowledging a fundamental error in judgment. He had seen similar moments during his own decades of service, where pride and prejudice had to be overcome by truth and humility. Morrison maintained his professional demeanor, but allowed a slight softening in his expression that suggested he appreciated Marcus's effort to make amends. "Sir, I understand that military traditions differ between our countries," he replied diplomatically. "Perhaps this has been a learning experience for us all." The police officer stepped forward to address the group. "Given the circumstances and Lance Corporal Morrison's preference not to press formal charges, I'm prepared to resolve this matter with a formal warning and an understanding that Colonel Wellington will issue a written apology to both the guard and his commanding officer." Marcus nodded immediately, grateful for the opportunity to avoid more serious legal consequences while taking responsibility for his actions. "I accept those terms completely," he said, "and I would like to do more than just write an apology. I want to understand what I witnessed here today." The brigadier smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Perhaps that's exactly what's needed," he said thoughtfully. "Lance Corporal, would you be willing to explain to our American colleague the history and significance of the Queen's Guard tradition?" With the permission of the police officer and his own chain of command, Morrison began to explain the centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard and its role in British military culture. He spoke about how the ceremonial duties were considered an honor, earned through military excellence, not a punishment or a decoration assignment for soldiers lacking combat experience. The Queen's Guard regiments, Morrison explained, trace their lineage back hundreds of years. The Grenadier Guards alone have battle honors from Waterloo, both World Wars, the Falklands, and recent operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Every soldier who stands these posts carries that history with him. Marcus listened intently, beginning to understand that what he had perceived as mere ceremony was actually a living connection to centuries of military tradition and sacrifice. The precision and discipline required for the ceremonial duties were the same qualities that made these soldiers effective in combat operations. The tourists see the uniform and the stillness, Morrison continued, but they don't see the physical and mental training required to maintain these standards. Standing at attention for hours in all weather conditions while remaining alert to potential security threats requires exactly the same discipline we use in combat situations. Sarah found herself learning as much as her husband, gaining new appreciation for traditions she had previously viewed as quaint historical remnants. The complexity and depth of what they were witnessing went far beyond anything she had expected from a simple tourist visit. The brigadier added historical context about how the Queen's Guard had evolved, from purely protective roles to become symbols of British military excellence recognized around the world. These young men represent the best of our armed forces, he explained. They earn their positions through merit and maintain them through continuous excellence. As the conversation continued, Marcus realized that his encounter with Morrison had taught him more about military professionalism than many formal training courses he had attended. The young guard's response to provocation, his maintenance of discipline under pressure, and his gracious handling of Marcus's apology demonstrated leadership qualities that transcended rank and nationality. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the courtyard as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Marcus found himself genuinely interested in observing the precision and tradition he had so recently dismissed, seeing it now through completely different eyes. "Would you mind?" Marcus asked Morrison hesitantly. "If my wife and I stayed to watch the ceremony? I feel like I have a lot to learn about what you do here." Morrison nodded with a slight smile, the first break in his professional demeanor since the incident began. 3 months later, Marcus sat in his office at Fort Bragg staring at a framed photograph on his desk. The image showed him standing respectfully beside Lance Corporal Morrison during the changing of the guard ceremony, both men in their dress uniforms, representing the mutual respect that had grown from their difficult first encounter. The incident at Buckingham Palace had become a turning point in Marcus's career and personal development. Upon returning to the United States, he had written not only the required formal apology but also a detailed report to his commanding officer about the lessons he had learned regarding international military cooperation and the importance of understanding Allied traditions. His colonel had been initially concerned about the international incident, but Marcus's honest account of his mistakes and what he had learned from them had actually enhanced his standing within the command structure. The report had been circulated as a case study in cultural sensitivity and professional military bearing, helping other officers avoid similar mistakes. Sarah noticed the positive changes in her husband immediately upon their return from London. The arrogance and competitive attitude that had sometimes made him difficult to live with had been replaced by a more thoughtful and humble approach to his interactions with fellow service members. He began seeking out opportunities to learn from others rather than constantly trying to prove his superiority. The correspondence between Marcus and Morrison had continued regularly since their meeting. What had begun as a formal apology had evolved into a genuine friendship between two professional soldiers who shared common values of service and dedication. Morrison had even visited Marcus and Sarah during a training exchange program, staying in their home and sharing stories of their respective military experiences. Through these conversations, Marcus learned that his initial assumptions about the differences between American and British military traditions were largely superficial. Both forces valued courage, discipline, and sacrifice, expressing these values through different customs and ceremonies but working toward the same fundamental goals of protecting their nations and allies. The incident had also affected Morrison, though in less dramatic ways. He had been commended by his superiors for his professional handling of a difficult situation, and his commanding officer had used the encounter as an example during training sessions about maintaining military bearing under provocation. Morrison's calm response had prevented an international incident while demonstrating the highest standards of British military professionalism. Marcus had also begun incorporating lessons learned from the Queen's Guard into his own leadership style. The patience, discipline, and attention to detail required for ceremonial duties, he realized, were exactly the qualities that made soldiers effective in combat situations. He started emphasizing these aspects of military training with his own troops, helping them understand the connection between seemingly mundane details and battlefield effectiveness. The story had spread throughout both the American and British military communities, becoming a teaching tool about the importance of respecting Allied traditions and avoiding cultural stereotypes. Marcus had been invited to speak at several military academies about his experience, using his mistake as an opportunity to help young officers develop better international military cooperation skills. During one of these speaking engagements, a young cadet asked Marcus what he had learned from the experience. His response had become something of a signature statement. "I learned that true military excellence isn't about proving you're better than someone else. It's about recognizing excellence wherever you find it and having the humility to learn from it." The photograph on his desk served as a daily reminder of that lesson. Every time Marcus felt the old competitive urges rising, he looked at the image of himself, standing beside Morrison, and remembered how much more he had accomplished through respect and cooperation than he ever had through confrontation and pride. Sarah often reflected on how the incident had strengthened their marriage as well. Seeing her husband acknowledge his mistakes and work to become a better person had deepened her respect for him in ways that his military achievements alone never could. The Marcus who had returned from London was not just a successful officer, but a more complete human being. As Marcus prepared for his final deployment before retirement, he carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The lesson he had learned from a young British Guard would influence his leadership for the rest of his career, proving that wisdom and growth can come from the most unexpected encounters when we have the courage to admit our mistakes and learn from them.